Okay. Today I'd like to go into some more details about some of the specific expressions of our planetary lineage. But I'd like to begin by going in the opposite direction, in a sense, which is towards more the essence of what our planetary lineage means. And by that I mean what we've been calling the Shambhala lineage, and especially more in the inner worlds, because the sort of essential unification, just the point of convergence of all the world lineages, not only even the focus of spirituality within the human kingdom, but in relationship to all life on the planet, doesn't have as strong and complete an expression within the human world as might be possible. To some extent it's there, but it finds its fullest expression in a vision and in beings who embody that vision that's particularly focused in inner dimensions. We could even say in the soul of the planet. And briefly, the essence of that vision is based in a fundamental spirit of spiritual enlightenment that is oriented towards our planet and embodies the simple spirit of a vision of serving evolution on our planet in a global way. And that the beings that embody that vision are essentially part of three main groups, although you could subdivide that quite a bit into a number of different sort of lineages, you might say, because this planetary lineage is nurtured not only by its presence in the world in a kind of ongoing suffusion of experience and beings that emerge from within the planet, that enrich the planetary lineage from within, but also from a larger context of sources and lineages that exist beyond our planet. So they come together in a focal point that we could call the essence or heart of our planetary lineage. And in the same way that we've talked before about each of us, or the cosmos as a whole, having several basic aspects in its most essential nature. One aspect is our transcendental or non-dual nature, sunyata, or the Tao. And in relationship to that, there's that aspect of our nature that realizes this truth, realizes the truth of our Buddha nature, our transcendental reality, the ground of our being. And then reflected within, and in some ways able to be sort of teased out into two distinct expressions, there's two facets to that realization. Qualitatively, we could say things like there's compassion and wisdom. Or even more simply, there's an active, a yin and a yang, an active and a receptive expression of this nature. On the receptive side is consciousness. In Hinduism, one of the basic imageries in the tantric traditions is this is embodied in the Shiva principle, the principle of pure consciousness. It's more formless. It's an essence of knowingness. And then the yang aspect is a more dynamic, a more expressive dimension. In the pure dimension of our experience, it arises as we have a capacity to witness life, to witness phenomena, even to witness deep aspects of our own nature, like our own thoughts arising and passing, intuitive perceptions, certainly sensations and emotions, desires and memories. Much of this, it has a more dynamic flavor. It moves, it arises and passes. There's vitality in it. There's direction. There's desire. And then there's the witness, a pure consciousness. Now, for most of us, this manifests less as a very pure and deeply equanimous consciousness, and more, it's somewhat more engaged. It's entangled in the doer. It's more opinionated. It has more preferences and attitudes and judgments. But it's within our ordinary grasp, even in people that aren't spiritually developed. It's generally accessible to be able to have moments of greater simplicity of awareness, a clarity where we kind of recede into a more detached observer mode. And this is the Shiva principle. This is consciousness. It's more formless. When you think about it, what is the essence of this principle? That's awareness. Does it necessarily have a location? The more we cultivate this awareness, the more it begins to start to feel more boundless. It expands beyond the boundary. Whereas phenomena that's arising are specific moments of concrete experience. Our body itself is located someplace in time and space. Within time and space, it can move about. Thoughts arise. Thoughts are specific, places. Your thoughts, my thoughts, thoughts that are out there in the general currents of the consciousness atmosphere of the planet. These things are more specific. They're more localized, but awareness itself, which has many layers, can move into a dimension that's more spacious, more formless. So consciousness in its essence is more formless. So formlessness and form, a more universal or conscious dimension, and a more specific, focused, concrete dimension of experience. So at the level of working with our own evolution, for instance, like if we cultivate a spacious, detached awareness that is non-judgmental and not involved, it's not trying to get away from anything, because it can be present to everything that's arising, but it's simply a quality of a sense of not necessarily needing anything, not grasping after anything, or of being averse to anything that's arising. In a sense, you could say any spiritual practice that kind of leans towards that type of quality, insight, perspective, spaciousness, equanimity, awareness, the witness, observation, investigation. These kind of lean towards the Shiva side. And then those that work more with our energy. So even something as simple as, like, if we say a statement of blessing or positivity, goodwill, there's an active dimension to that. And that's more Shakti in that. Or if we work with energy, if we visualize light, or we feel project energy in some way. Even if we move our physical bodies in the world, there's more Shakti involved in that dimension of experience. So in a sense, there's two basic styles of spirituality, working with the form, energetic Shakti style, or working with the Shiva consciousness, wisdom, spaciousness aspect. So in a teaching like something on a fairly pure form of the Shiva approach is Vipassana, which emphasizes a very pure quality of awareness, of witnessing. Whereas if we do something like, chanting or a breathing practice, we're engaged in something more active, and especially practices like pranayama, for instance, are very involved in the breath and in energy. Qigong, energy mastery, this is more of a Shakti type of a thing. So in the same way that there's that distinction, both at the simple level of our ordinary experience, and then we can see practices that kind of mirror that distinction, mind and body, within ourselves. So too in the planetary lineage, there's basically, these, in a sense, there's three facets. One that leans towards the Shakti side, one that leans more towards the Shiva side, kind of working with supporting the evolution of life in all its many forms on our planet, human and otherwise, in one of these two modes, like a specialization in one of those directions, or that which is more balanced, a marriage of those two approaches. And even though there's those that lean one way or another, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're out of balance, that they're doing that. There are intelligences in our world, especially in other dimensions, or even within nature, that do lean one way or the other. In some cases are not yet really awakened to the idea of becoming more balanced. Basic kind of meaning, you might say, the purpose of the human kingdom is to cultivate that balance. So some of the spiritual beings that work specifically with humanity, in many ways, the heart of their orientation is that more balanced approach they're expressing. But invariably, they still are going to tend to have a leaning one way or the other. It's just kind of a functional, or it's like having a job. You specialize, so you have strengths, but at the same time, you're kind of growing and expanding. On a global level, beyond the human kingdom, the Shakti tradition, one of its many and vast areas of work, is working with nature. Another aspect is that there are orders of archangelic intelligences that work with spiritually, with a spiritual vision. They work with the elements, both, well, basically on many different levels, both in the physical world, in subtler worlds, and relationship to different kinds of life. So that, for instance, each of us has a physical body and a personality, an etheric body, subtler bodies. And these bodies, in one sense, you could say, well, they kind of arise from nature. But more deeply, they actually are their emergence, their both evolution and their existence for each of us in each incarnation. These bodies are actually provided by what could be called Shakti, or holy spiritual or archangelic intelligences that specialize in working with the elements, understand the purpose of human incarnation, and build bodies for us in each incarnation. So a human body isn't really something that could arise in nature the way we experience it without the support of these intelligences, which participate in each incarnation, orchestrating, building these bodies. So for instance, when it's time for a soul to come into incarnation, not only is a soul connected to a specific physical body, but the personality that's going to begin to emerge, the subtle bodies, begin to be constructed by these intelligences. And they also, certain specific subdivisions of these groups, understand the karmic history of that individual, and in consort with that soul and with other guiding intelligences, make decisions about which karma will be implanted in the subconscious of that individual for that incarnation. And then the process goes forward of completing the process of the birthing of that personality and its emergence. So it's key to the whole process of incarnation that these intelligences are there, not only during the process of forming personality and orchestrating and facilitating incarnation, but then throughout the lifetime of that individual. So there's many of these kinds of intelligences. That's, of course, just one example, that are not only involved in the human kingdom, but spiritually supporting the evolution of and the existence of life on our planet. Now, for some cosmologies, this is envisioned as all of this is being, sort of orchestrated by a single divine intelligence, a deity, that ultimately gave rise to the universe in the first place, the sort of creator deity vision. My own personal experience is more in a different direction, which is more the notion that there are tremendous intelligences like that, great logi or primordial Buddhas and Christ, you might say, some of a very, increasingly vast levels of presence and realization, and that these beings are indeed behind orchestrating that this phenomenon takes place, but that these types of intelligence, even the very most advanced of them, didn't bring the universe into existence in the first place. That's another mystery that we'll might perhaps talk about some more in the future. But there isn't necessarily a need to believe in a creator deity in order to understand that these and relate to that these realities exist, the realities of these, for instance, archangelic hierarchies and what their vision is. But their vision is generally supporting awakening, it's supporting liberation, it's supporting spiritual evolution in all forms of life, ultimately with the aim of bringing beings to a profound experience of liberation, of nirvana, and of a maturing of their own love and capacity to participate in collective awakening as well. More obscurely on the other side, there are beings that work more in the formless dimensions. In a sense, you could say they work more with pure qualities and the infusion and the building of those qualities into different kinds of beings, human and otherwise. So we'll come back to that a little bit more later when we have a sort of broader context. For now, we're talking about this mainly just to kind of broaden our discussion of the planetary lineage and develop a sense of the richness. It's not primarily or exclusively focused on the human kingdom. It's very broad in its richness, nor is the planetary lineage primarily focused through spiritual lineages in the human kingdom. There are what could be called sort of invisible expressions of the planetary lineage in certain of its expressions that do things like support each of us having a physical body, because having a physical body is part of the support that this lineage provides. It's an opportunity, a special opportunity to have a human form to accelerate our spiritual development. And so a great amount of care and skill goes into creating not only specific human bodies, but the whole environment of the human kingdom, and even many of the dimensions of the way the planet can evolve that not only provides an opportunity for humans to exist, but for other forms of life that are part of a planetary expression to also evolve at the same time within that planet. So these are some of the essential subdivisions of a planetary lineage, and they're embedded in vaster systems like the orders, some of the orders that I was just talking about, and there's quite a variety of them, many more than what I talked about so far, of course, have their, you might say, sort of foundation, or they're embedded in much vaster communities beyond our planet's solar and cosmic expressions of these very same principles. Part of the vision for the human kingdom, as we've talked a bit about before, is that a human being not only awakens spiritually through this process over many lives, but also as an expression of the marriage of these realities. Each of us awakens within ourselves a union of Shiva and Shakti, and through that marriage attains a kind of consciousness that's not possible if you are kind of ultimately leaning one way or the other excessively. So invariably, each person has an ancient background, and there's a history there, and so that isn't just overcome immediately. Even as we get into more advanced levels of development, it'll just suddenly become balanced. So even great bodhisattvas have leanings still, but the general thrust of their evolution is that a profound marriage is taking place, and that ultimately beings achieve very deep levels of balance. And so the deepest beings on our planet that are members of the planetary lineage express very profound levels of a union of these principles within themselves. Relative to us, though, as human beings, the most profound levels of balance are not yet achieved until levels that actually go beyond our planet. So beings like solar intelligences are very profound, relative to us, are very profound levels of balance. And so some of the deepest or sort of guidance and envisioning of orders that guide evolution in worlds like our planet actually have their foundation at deeper levels than our planetary lineage. And our planetary lineage is guided and inspired by those larger, vaster individual beings and whole orders of beings. Now, we talked a little bit previously about some perspectives about our current order. So I wanted to take a moment to go a little deeper into some of the specifics about that. For instance, we talked about the history in our current cycle, which for many of us is something that goes back tens of thousands of years and has different expressions in the world. So as our planetary lineage integrates into The human kingdom, one of its expressions is as explicit planetary and traditions, and also specific, more local spiritual traditions and orders that try to teach the conscious aspect of humans more about spirituality. So this is a basic expression. We sometimes might tend to just sort of think that's the Dharma. The way the Dharma works in the world is that there are, humans have spiritual lineages, and that's where our spirituality is to be found. But actually, the planetary lineage not only works extensively with all forms of life on our planet, but also within the human kingdom works with nurturing spiritual evolution within humanity from a variety of different angles, including, as I said before, facilitating even the fact of incarnation and the presence and sustenance of our bodies, even the after-death experiences of different types of awakening and learning and maturing that can continue to go on after you leave incarnation. But also in other ways as well, there's strong presence of inspiration and guidance that goes into supporting other aspects of human culture, politics and education and the healing arts, and all of these facets, not just the religious and spiritual traditions, are nurtured by the planetary lineage, often invisibly, but also in other ways that members are trained to not only advance in their spiritual development, but also take specific incarnations as bodhisattvas, where whether they're conscious of it or not, and very often they're not, they participate in culture and they become an artist or a philosopher or a political leader of some sort. And very often there's a sort of flow back and forth. There's lives where these people are more directly involved in spiritual traditions and are sometimes even in orders that are renunciate or heavily emphasize meditation, and then also at other times have lives where they're more engaged. In a sense, those are, it's kind of like in another way, those are Shiva and Shakti leaning lives, and that brings about balance in them too, to have these different kinds of incarnations. So in our current cycle, a very profound part of our lineage, a very sort of strong presence of the planetary lineage in the world, has its most ancient foundations in India. Now, with a certain amount of kind of regional perspective, we tend to think of certain specific areas of the world, and we think of India or the Himalayas or Tibet or China or what have you as specific areas. But for this cycle and for a large portion of humanity, the part of our spiritual or planetary lineage that's focused in India and emerged there tens of thousands of years ago was a kind of birthing place for an impulse from our planetary lineage that established a basic spiritual inspiration, an energy, and a quality, an approach that has essentially on a spiritual level set the tone for a fairly large portion of humanity for tens of thousands of years. Most anciently, this tradition, at least in terms of our current sort of historical awareness, was called the Sanatana Dharma, which simply means the ageless wisdom, approximately. In more modern times, a direct kind of continuation of that tradition is called Hinduism. But that's not the name that they originally, that's something that was sort of outsiders, Westerners, I think maybe even somebody like Alexander the Great and people like that came up with that term. I think that when somebody like Alexander arrived in India and his conquests, he went into the Indus Valley and encountered Indians living there and called them Indus. And that kind of came down over time as the Hindus. But they called their own dharma, their own understanding of reality, their own spiritual way, simply the Sanatana Dharma. To their mind, it was just the universal Dharma. There wasn't boundaries. There wasn't one tradition or another tradition. So this part of the world Dharma is not exactly the same as, say, Native American teachings, but it is very vast, and it had a profound influence of not only throughout India, but throughout that part of the world, certainly into Tibet, ultimately in large ways into China and the Far East, but also in ways that we're beginning to understand more and more in the last century or two, throughout the Middle East, and therefore into Europe, and now certainly into the modern forms of expression that carry that same energy into places like North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and various other places like that around the world. So that lineage is very pervasive. From certain, some of the modern teachings that came out in the West through people like Blavatsky, terminology arose about things like cycles, root races, which sort of express distinct sort of spiritual impulses within the human kingdom. So this is the beginning of the fifth root race. It emerged in India, closely connected to Shambhala, many tens of thousands of years ago, and has come down into modern times. It's a vast tradition, and it's very multifaceted. There's barely anything that exists in the world in any of the spiritual traditions that you can't find within Hinduism. There are profound bhakti or devotional leaning approaches that are profound philosophical and wisdom and consciousness-oriented approaches that are deeply world-engaged traditions, karma yoga. In fact, the majority of Hindus practice karma yoga because they're householders. And often they perform rituals, and they give alms, and they try to practice with a spirit of detachment and devotion in day-to-day lives. Usually for the average Hindu, there's a strong kind of mixture of karma yoga and bhakti yoga. There's usually some form, some face of deity that they worship. Often it's Kali or it's Vishnu. And there's a pervasive sense of devotion. But also there are advanced energetic practices, the pranayama traditions, the kundalini traditions, the tantric traditions. There's just a tremendous spectrum. The whole possibility for human spirituality is represented in one form or another in India. And there's always been a long tradition of service to humanity and to the world in the Hindu tradition. But over the years, there's also been outgrowths. And 2,500 years ago, one of the most important sort of outgrowths within the Hindu tradition was Buddhism. So since that time, perhaps the two most powerful expressions of the ancient Dharma that was at the foundation of our this sort of modern expression of human spirituality. Modern, I mean, in a sort of larger context of, in the recent thousands of years, is a kind of combination of the Hindu-Buddhist tradition, which was deeply present in India for over 1,000 years. The Muslims entered, some of the Mongol invaders entered, actually primarily about 1,200 years ago, there was an infusion of from the Middle East of Islam, and being much more focused in theism, they were uncomfortable with a lack of embrace of theism in Buddhism. So Buddhism was kind of oppressed after that in India. But for over 1,000 years, it was profoundly present. as a kind of dual tradition. And Hinduism tends to have a flavor of a decent amount of acceptance. There are certain elements within Hinduism, as in any tradition, that are more sectarian, and so there is that. But relatively speaking, the ancient Sanatana Dharma, the spirit of how that manifested in India and Himalaya, was fairly open, and many traditions arose: the Jains, and the Buddhists, the Sikhs, and others. And but Buddhism was perhaps one of the most profound expressions that emerged within the Sanatana Dharma. Many Hindus really don't see Buddhism as separate. They see it as a sort of branch of the Sanatana Dharma. And one of the things that was particularly powerful about the Buddhist development within the Sanatana Dharma was that the Buddha had a profound capacity to go to the essence of things and recognize that which was within this enormous richness in the Hindu tradition and in the other traditions, that subdivisions of the Dharma in that part of the world, like the Jain tradition. He saw it into sort of the essential purity, what was the clearest recognition of the Dharma, and he emphasized that. He sort of brought that, and things that were somewhat present there, like the caste system, he rejected and just took the deepest, purest aspects of the Dharma. It's like a rebirth of the Dharma through the Buddha. So the Buddha had this enormously impactful presence on the transition of the Dharma in the world. And because the Buddha had prepared for that incarnation for a long period of time, as a bodhisattva, he cultivated many qualities and a vastness of wisdom that brought his spiritual development to an extraordinary level. When the Buddha incarnated, this was essentially viewed as a great planetary event. And so many hundreds of planetary masters incarnated at the same time and became disciples of the Buddha. This was an unparalleled event in sort of recorded history on our planet, in that many times we have had many great masters: Krishna, Jesus, Lao Tse, Padmasambhava, and so on. But the Buddha's incarnation was extraordinary in a number of ways. We could do like a whole webinar on the deeper realities, the significance of the Buddha's life and contribution. But one of the truths that reflects how profound Buddha's presence in the world was and the impact that he had was that it is said that about 900 arhats incarnated and became Buddha's disciples during his incarnation. This is an extraordinary thing. When you think about arhats are fourth degree initiates, so we're not talking about only fourth degree initiates. There are some were fifth, sixth, seventh degree initiates incarnated at the same time with the Buddha, and became, many of the most advanced became his leading disciples. And so there was this, in a sense, it was as if a great representation of the planetary lineage co-incarnated with the Buddha simultaneously and established an extraordinary presence of enlightenment in the world around this new sort of rebirth of the Dharma that took place at this time. And this set in motion a powerful influence that has been unparalleled. There's never been a single being in recorded history that alone initiated a transmission that generated in subsequent generations so many bodhisattvas, so many liberated beings, so many masters. The Hindu tradition has generated thousands of masters. It's an extraordinary tradition as a whole. But the ancient sources of Hinduism go back into unrecorded history. And one of the things we know about them is there's been countless rishis, countless ancient masters. In fact, there was a time in many thousands of years ago where these families, these individuals actually lived as householders. We see some of this in the records like the Mahabharata, where in ancient times in the Vedas. There are great masters who lived in families of so many rishis in the world at a time. So one of the beauties of the so-called Hindu tradition or the Sanatana Dharma is that it's not centered around a specific individual. So there's always been great individuals, the Patanjalis and the Shankaras and Narada and Narayana and Vyasa and so on. Many great teachers, many sublineages, Ramanuja and so on. In the Buddha's life, this is a sort of different kind of expression of the Dharma. A single individual came into the world and kind of rebirthed the Dharma in a specific way that was very clarifying and illuminating and deepening, and set in motion an impulse that not only was co-birthed by hundreds of other masters that co-incarnated with him, but left a lineage behind that's still strong and growing in the world today, and is profoundly influential in terms of the world's spirituality. In a sense, you could say that there's an aspect of human spirituality that's more detailed. It's like, for instance, if a person feels an inspiration to try to better the world through becoming involved in politics, that's human spirituality at work. And it's taking the specific form of, let's say, that person being involved in politics in some way. They may have gotten this inspiration from it. They may not be outwardly particularly affiliated with the spiritual tradition. They might just feel this natural love of humanity and this basic, motivation to express that in that way. Or they may be inspired by a particular tradition, whatever that might be. There is, a way that's expressing in the world, and such a person may become an artist, or they may simply be someone that helps. They may live in a village in South America and just be a sort of elder and a wiser person and a loving person, and just be a sort of inspiration and guide to their community. It can take many forms. So the expression of a spiritual lineage is a specific kind of way that spirituality comes into the world. Christianity is another tradition that's had a tremendous impact. Jesus's life was enormously inspiring. But the legacy that Jesus left behind was not quite the same as the Buddha's, in the sense that there wasn't as profound a clear enunciation of a path to self-realization, to becoming a Christ, in the same way that the Buddha left behind. So it's almost as if there was a bit of a more world-engaged leaning, and that in fact the spirit of Christ's teachings was in some ways oriented more towards humanity in general. There was a morality of love and forgiveness and service. It was an inspiration for a kind of life of just trying to be a better person and coming closer to God. What the Buddha left behind was a tremendously sophisticated psychology and set of practices that have been extraordinarily powerful in empowering beings to become Christ themselves. And so, in that sense, we don't see quite the legacy in Christianity of constantly generating in every generation extraordinary masters at the same level as we see in traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, it's not because this isn't a competition. It's like a different emphasis. What part of the world are you? In a sense, the Buddha came to a location in the world that was very ripe for this kind of thing. In a sense, India is very close, and the Himalayas are close to Shambhala, and so it's as if a very pure, deep expression of the Dharma is easier to take place there. Jesus' incarnation, it's not that Jesus was any less capable of revealing a profound Dharma. He just had the Dharma to incarnate into the world that wasn't an area of the world that wasn't as ripe for that depth of revelation and that depth of tradition to be established. So they're both, in a certain sense, very profound expressions of the Dharma, but they have different specific functions. Similarly with other expressions of the Dharma, like in Islam or Judaism or Taoism, Native American tradition, each in its own context, each according to the styles and the karmic ripeness of those communities and so on. Now, on a deeper level, Buddhism and Christianity are actually, and Hinduism are actually deeply connected to each other. They're actually all part of this single tradition. It's almost as if the Buddha's teachings spoke more directly to the soul of human beings, and that Christ's incarnation in the Middle East was almost more talking to the personality of human beings than the average human being. And both of those transmissions are important. One generates masters and one nurtures humanity as a whole. And of course, they both overlap. There's been great masters within Christianity. There's an aspect of Buddhism that's spread to embrace all kinds of people at all levels of development. I'll come back to that question in just a minute. Thanks. So, in one sense, it's my sense that one of the reasons that the Buddha has become the planetary logos is because there is the greatest sort of concentration of expressing the Dharma around a single individual in manifestation in the human kingdom around the Buddha than any other individual in history. There's been many profound individuals like Shankara, for instance. But within Hinduism, for instance, Shankara's influence is specific. The Advaita Vedanta tradition, the Swami orders, and so on are specifically influenced by Shankara. And there's many other orders, isn't there? The Nath tradition, for example, is a distinctly different tradition. Those that emphasize things like Raja Yoga or the Bhakti traditions, Ramanuja, different philosophical approaches, these all branch off in other lineages and from other individuals. So Shankara certainly had a profound impact and is considered in the planetary hierarchy as one of the greatest masters who's incarnated in humanity in the last several thousand years. But his specific impact was more focused within a part of Hinduism. In that context, you can see that Buddha's impact was much vaster. Is the single individual responsible for an entire lineage. That's exclusive focus was the Dharma. That's another thing that's interesting about Buddhism is that many times religious traditions grow up around in a multifaceted way, like in Hinduism, for example. The average practitioner in a local village in India is not studying Shankara, they're not reading Patanjali, very often they're not even reading the Bhagavad Gita. Very often they can't even read. They're maybe influenced by a local Brahmin priest. There are strong kind of folk religion elements to their approach. They generally don't believe that they have a possibility of becoming enlightened in that lifetime. So what they try to do is just be a good person, accumulate better karma, and hope in a future birth that they can get onto the path in a deeper way. And so they mix their vague awareness of the deeper possibilities of the Dharma with a lot of something that's more shamanic, more kind of engaged in ordinary life in the sense of, if they want to start a business, then they go to the local astrologer, and they don't engage the astrologer asking for guidance about their spiritual path. They ask for a prediction of an auspicious time to begin their business. Or they go to the astrologer to ask about, what's a good person to marry one of their children to. They look further right. So that their approach to the Dharma turns into something that becomes more worldly ultimately and is more integrated into their human personality values. So the average practitioner says many aspects of Hinduism that actually aren't very deep doorways into the Dharma. They're just kind of integrated into the ordinary lives of ordinary individuals. In a sense, part of what the Buddha did is he being immersed in this tradition, and not only, of course, in that life, but from many lifetimes, took the deepest essence of that tradition, especially in a sense, that aspect of the tradition that was aimed towards initiates, towards people who wanted to consciously become Christs and Buddhas themselves. And he distilled that down into a very pure version of the Dharma, and then birthed a tradition that was focused in that and didn't have any of the other baggage. It was purified of a lot of superstition and ritualism and all other elements that were not the pure, direct way to self-realization and bodhisattvahood for the individual. So in that sense, too, Buddhism is somewhat unique in having been expressed into the world, primarily targeting people who want to awaken. And so it's been a particularly efficient way to bring large numbers of people over the millennia to profound levels of spiritual development. So these are some of the reasons I feel that the Buddha is one of our greatest, perhaps in many people's minds, the most extraordinary master on our planet at this time. This seemed to be the opinion, by the way, of the masters that Blavatsky knew, the masters that inspired the whole sort of Western esoteric movement. And that would include individuals like Alice Bailey and Helena, and Nicholas Roerich, and so on. Regardless of how each specific individual might have expressed the Dharma in their own teachings, the core tradition behind all of that, that we call sometimes the Trans-Himalayan tradition, that the masters that Blavatsky knew personally. Blavatsky, for instance, started seeing these masters from a very early age because she was clairvoyant. And then when she was about 20 years old, she was in London and she saw one of them on the street. He was visiting London. Later in the week, they met each other in one of the parks in London and began a conscious relationship in which this master, Moria, began to guide her education. And he would do things like he would send her correspondences, and eventually they would have a telepathic report. He would say, I want you to, go to this place in the Middle East and study with this Sufi master. And now I want you to go to Canada and study with this Native American. And for 20 years, he had her travel around the world, studying with people from all different kinds of traditions, many of whom were also part of this community of hidden masters, specifically the so-called Trans-Himalayan lineage, which has its two main outposts in Tibet, and certainly therefore in India, and in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, but spread throughout the Middle East and Europe as well. Now, of course, it's expanding even further, but we'll come back to that in a moment. The head of this specific lineage, which is a major expression of the planetary lineage, was, as we've talked about a little bit so far, being known as the Mahachohan or Mahachokan. We don't really have a name for this individual. He had various, designations like that. Very often they simply called him the chief because he was the incarnate head of the lineage. He lived in Tibet and outwardly was affiliated with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So when Moria and Kutumi would travel, they considered essentially Tibet their home base, and near Shigatse, which is where the Tashi Longpo monastery is. The chief, or the Mahachokan, lived at the Tashi Longpo monastery. And they were very close with the Panchen Lama as well. But of course, they had contacts throughout Tibet and throughout Tibetan Buddhism, but also within the other traditions. So one way to understand the nature of this version of our planetary lineage, the trans-Himalayan lineage that was deeply connected to, was the source of Blavatsky and subsequent, so all these other masters like Kuthumi and Maurya, Serapis and Hilarion were all part of this one tradition. And in a sense can be looked at as having three main dimensions to it. So if you were to ask, if you meet one of these masters in the flesh and you say, what is your lineage? There's really kind of a few levels. The deepest level, this master might say, well, this really doesn't have a name that you could put on it using ordinary designations. It's not Christian, it's not Buddhist, it's not Hindu. So at the deepest level, it's what we've been calling in this webinar the planetary lineage. But as members of the planetary lineage express themselves in the physical world, they tend to affiliate with some kind of deep core expression of some version of spirituality that exists in the world. And for the trans-Himalayan lineage, that was Buddhism and is Buddhism. That's their central focus. But as members of the planetary lineage, they're very comprehensive, or you might say integral in their approach. So it's not just it's not actually strictly just Buddhism, and neither at the essential level would they say it's Buddhist because it's the planetary lineage as a whole, that's their inspiration. Nor at a manifest level is it strictly Buddhist because they incorporate elements of all kinds of traditions from the Far East to, that's why, for instance, Maurya had Blavatsky traveling all around the world studying with Christian mystics and Sufis and Kabbalists and Native Americans as well as, and she spent 2.5 years in Tibet. She was one of the first Westerners to be given access because, these masters had connections like the Panchen Lama and to many other members of Tibetan Buddhism. When, incidentally, that people like Maurya and Kuthumi would go to Tibet, they would dress as Gelugpa monks in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition because that's the order, that the sub-order of Tibetan Buddhism that the Ma Chohan, the chief, was affiliated with. But they would be recognized as unusual. In fact, there's even into the 20th century, people like Nicholas Roerich, who went to, in like the 30s, went to Tibet looking for these masters, hoping to find them. And one of the lamas that he met said, "Oh yes, I know about them. They had a specific Tibetan term." And he said, "Yes, these are not ordinary lamas. We have our own high lamas, and then there's these extraordinary masters. There's something different." And he had a special name, which I forget right now, for that group. And he said, "I've never met one myself, but my own master was a student of one of them, and they got this unusual teaching that's not contained within ordinary Tibetan Buddhism from these masters. And I actually was given some of those teachings by my master, but I don't, all I know is that they have one of their centers near Shigatse and that they're not there anymore. They seem to have sort of receded even more deeply into the recesses of the mountains, and they're not accessible there anymore." So again, even though on one level, they were deeply connected to Buddhism in general and Tibetan Buddhism specifically. In fact, there's what's called a letter, but it's not technically a letter because the Ma Chokan didn't write it himself. But Kuthumi had a conversation with the chief, and both he and Maurya and other masters talked about the chief as like their guru. There's always, sort of like guru-disciple relationships in a lineage. And so someone might be like a disciple of the Tibetan, who was, of course, one of the well-known masters within the Western esoteric tradition, his kind of nickname was Tibetan DK. So he would have referred to, say, Kudhumi as his master, but then Kudhumi would say that his master was the Mahachohan. So in the Hindu tradition, they would say that's the Mahaguru. The Tibetan would say, my Mahaguru is the chief. He's my master's master. So one of the, when they would go to Tibet, say Kudhumi would, as I said earlier, dress like a Gelugpa monk. So he would wear like orange robes and, or is it maroon? I forget. And one time, some of the Theosophists were in the foothills of the Himalayas, and they were curious to see, what kind of evidence they could find. This is like, maybe the 1890s, after Blavatsky had left, and wondering, is there other kinds of evidence we could find? And they encountered a peddler, Tibetan peddler, someone who would go back and forth between India. He would gather objects, things to sell in India, and you bring them to India and sell them and go back and forth. So they saw this peddler, and so they happened to ask him, do you know anything about these masters? And he said, yeah, I actually met one of them once. He said he didn't know what his name was, but he said his followers were called the Kudhumpas. Now in Sanskrit, pa, one of its meanings can mean a follower of. So a Kudhumpa would mean a disciple or follower of Kudhumi. He said that there was this master. He said he wore a Tibetan outfit without sleeves, but he had long hair, which he said was very unusual because most of the monks were shaved, had bald heads in that order. But he said this fellow had very long hair, and also had this unusual following with them. They were traveling by foot, but this master, who we know obviously was Kudhumi, also was known to ride a horse sometimes. And he said he even had a conversation with him, and he also watched him heal somebody. He was sitting on the side of the road, and one of the local peasants came up to Kudhumi and asked for a healing. And Kudhumi took a bunch of rice and crushed it in his hand into a ball and blew on it and handed it to the person, and he ate it and was healed. So there are, within the sort of lore of this tradition, the so-called Theosophical and Western esoteric tradition that kind of grew out of that, there are many of these stories. There's at least 25 people, for instance, who were part of the early Theosophical movement from between about 1875 to about 1920, who physically encountered one or other of these masters, Hilarion or Kotze, who were both Middle Eastern, European masters. But even they were recognized to be deeply connected to Buddhism as well. For instance, the master Serapis, who looked to this core Shambhala trans-Himalayan lineage as his own inspiration and lineage. Masters in that group from the Middle East would travel to Tibet. For instance, Blavatsky talked about being in Shagatsi with the masters there, and people like Hilarion would arrive and viewed the Mahachohan as the chief of their lineage too, or part of the same group. So even though outwardly different masters would live, there was a Swami Narayan who was part of the lineage. He was outwardly Hindu, so if you encountered him in India, he was dressed like a Swami, would identify outwardly and be part of Shankara's order. This is the Swami order. But he was again part of this lineage, and on a deeper level, he was connected to this sort of advanced esoteric form of Buddhism that ultimately was rooted in this transcendent lineage that has no real name in the world, in the sense that it's just the eternal Dharma, the planetary lineage. We see some of this in other places too. I mentioned Swami Rama in the previous talk. Swami Rama had a great master who was certainly one of the more hidden masters that are part of the planetary lineage. His connection was more via the Hindu tradition. His name was Bengali Baba. And Bengali Baba also was very advanced, certainly post-mastery, very great master. And then he had a guru whose name we don't know, who, although having been born in India, he spent much time in Tibet. In fact, when Swami Ram was studying in India with his master, his Mahaguru, his guru's guru, was living in a cave in the Trans-Himalayan range deep in Tibet. So it took him several months to travel and find him there. And he was just alone. People would travel to visit with him. People apparently knew about him, but he was essentially living alone in this cave there. Very great master. So when Swami Rama went to find him and spent some time with him there, at one point he said, "What is our lineage exactly?" He wanted clarification. Exactly, what is the nature of our lineage? He said, well, outwardly we're affiliated with Shankara's order, but at a deeper level, we're actually part of something else, something more, something deeper. Right there, we see a very good example of what I'm talking about this sort of multi-level identity that members, especially the more hidden masters in the planetary lineage, often have. So for instance, in this so-called trans-Himalayan lineage, the multi-level identity, it's really probably best seen as having kind of three layers. The deepest level is they identify with being part of the planetary lineage, and there's no real name for that I'm aware of, but in the sense that we can't connect it exclusively to a particular tradition. So that's what Swami Rama's Mahaguru was referring to. There's something deeper that we're actually connected to and a part of. Incidentally, as I mentioned before, they trace, even though at one level they trace their lineage to Shankar, and they were Swamis, which is a designation for members of Shankara's order. They actually traced their lineage back to Sanat Kumara, who the Hindu tradition recognizes as having had a physical incarnation about 3,500 years ago in India. Excuse me. Let's see how we're doing for time. So at one level, it's that deep planetary lineage identification that these lineages have. So in the Trans-Himalayan lineage, you see evidence of that. For instance, at one point, somebody wrote a book while Blavatsky was still alive, a man named Sinet, who had received many letters from Kutumi. They had a long correspondence over 4 years, many dozens of letters back and forth. So Sinet took a lot of these teachings he got from Kutumi, and he wrote a book called Esoteric Buddhism, saying, this is some of the teachings I've gotten from Kutumi, and he decided to call it Esoteric Buddhism. And Blavatsky and some of the masters had to respond and say, well, that's sort of correct, but not really, because what this is something actually unknown even in the more esoteric schools of Buddhism. It's something connected to the Shambhala order, this secret tradition behind the scenes. So it's kind of esoteric Buddhism, and it's kind of something best described in its deepest levels is beyond that. And yet on a secondary level, many of these subgroups, and there's really only a handful of them in the world, have some profound affiliation for the Trans-Himalayan lineage. It's Buddhism. So for instance, in this letter I began to mention earlier that Kutumi wrote again and sent it to somebody, I forget who, eventually became published in one of these small volumes called Letters from the Masters of Wisdom, where there's letters from people like Serapis and Hilarion and Kutumi, and even this very famous letter in the Theosophical movement, because even though it wasn't penned by the Mahachohan, there's essentially a discussion that Kutumi and the Mahachohan had about the Theosophical Society and its intended destiny, its vision. And he wanted that to be transmitted by blood. So Kutumi wrote it down, essentially fashioned a kind of letter out of that, and then had it published. And essentially in that letter, one of the things that the Ma Chohan does is describe how their strongest outer affiliation with the existing traditions in the world is Buddhism. He described it, this is the head of the Trans-Himalayan lineage. In his words, he said, it's the purest expression of the Dharma that we currently have in the world. As far as what major religions go as an entirety, the Buddha Dharma is the clearest expression of that. And even, by the way, Daskalos seemed to recognize that, because Daskalos at one time said, and he wasn't including Jesus in this, of course, but he said that the Buddha was the greatest Christian who ever lived. So even in that tradition, even through someone like Daskalos, whose identification was more towards Christianity, he recognized something very unique about the Buddha in this way, that was a very profound expression of the Christ principle in the Buddha's life. Because part of what the spirit of deep Buddhism is to bring about the most profound marriage of love and wisdom, of Shiva and Shakti, of mind and body, the basic dimensions of human nature into a profound non-dual wholeness. And the Buddha is considered by many people to be certainly at least among the most extraordinary manifestations of that. There's a question about Morya and Kuthumi. What kind of name is Morya and Kuthumi? They sound made up. Same as Serapis and Joao Kul. It's deliberately to mask their nationality norm. So, no, not exactly. Actually, Morya is a Sanskrit name. There's an ancient clan in the north of India called the Morya clan. There's speculation, of course, among theosophists about what exactly Master's Morya affiliation would be to that clan, but it's considered a lunar lineage and actually has a very ancient connection to Buddhism. Incidentally, though, Morya himself, we don't know his personal name in terms of like the family that he was born into. Morya was clearly a spiritual name that he was either given or adopted. And he was born a Rajput prince into the Hindu tradition. And so, like a lot of these masters, he wore several hats. If he was in Tibet, he would dress as a Gelugpa monk, and he was profoundly versed in Tibetan Buddhism and would blend into that tradition and be part of that world. So he spent some of his time in Tibet. They were close to the Panchen Lama. There's a very esoteric dimension of theosophy too that has to do with the mysteries of the nature of the Panchen Lama and why the Ma Chohan had a close relationship to the Panchen Lama. But knowing the Panchen Lama also lived at Tashi Lungpo Monastery, and somewhere outside of Shagatsi, he had a summer retreat, and it was there that Morya and Kuthumi and the Tibetan and others had their own, places to live, their own homes, you might say. And so when Blavatsky went there, she spent a lot of time there with them, and she spent a little bit of time over at Tashi Lungpo Monastery as well. She actually spent quite a few years in total in Tibet, but the one concentrated period was about 2.5 years, but she had been there before that and went several times after that as well. So even though Morya was born an Indian, when he was there, he would appear as a Tibetan Buddhist, but then in India, he would often dress and participate in the Hindu tradition, but they also had a strong affiliation with the Sikh tradition. So one time, for instance, some of the theosophists, I think one of them was Alcott, was at Amritsar and at the Golden Temple, and he actually saw Kuthumi there dressed as a Sikh, and just kind of blending into the situation. there acting unobtrusively. There wasn't any commotion around him. He was just kind of blending into the situation quietly off to the side, and Walcott happened to recognize him because he had encountered him on other occasions. On another occasion, for instance, when Kuthumi one time appeared in Scotland to Alice Bailey in the physical body when she was 15, he was dressed as a European in a suit. So they would kind of just morph themselves in and out of different personas or adopt different traditions to kind of be able to make contact. And very often people within a specific community or tradition would not know that they were part of this larger thing. They'd just say, oh, this person's a Sikh, or they're one of us, and they blend in, and then in the next situation they would transform into it with, dress differently and be so deeply knowledgeable in those traditions that they would be respected profoundly by members of other traditions as well. So you have the deepest levels, this identification with the planetary lineage as a whole. At another level, in the case of the trans-Himalayan lineage, the sort of primary manifest identification was more with Buddhism, but being a very integral tradition, it incorporated elements of many different traditions. So if you actually are exposed to the teachings of that tradition, you won't see them following strictly Tibetan Buddhism. They will borrow widely from other traditions and also introduce ideas that aren't represented in any other tradition. And then the third level outwardly is kind of like what local lineage are they specifically identified with, or maybe they have multiple hats, as in the case, for instance, I just gave of Bright Moria and Kuthumi. Another example would be, for instance, Serapis, who outwardly, in one of his letters, in the letters to the Masters of Wisdom, you can find some letters from Serapis, and in one of them he's quoting the Dhammapada. So he was definitely knowledgeable about Buddhism and identified, with that lineage, which traced its chief to, the sort of deeply esoteric planetary version of the lineage. But outwardly, Serapis was a Coptic master who blended the Egyptian mysteries and Christianity. And you see, again, Hilarion was referred to as being a master of the Neo-Alexandrian tradition, which is Neoplatonism, and sort of a syncretic, expression, but it's specifically kind of like an ancient Middle Eastern, Egyptian-based kind of Greek and some Christianity and Kabbalah and things like that. But very Neoplatonic as a core element of that. Apparently, Hilarion had been Iamblichus as in one of his previous incarnations. Serapis, by the way, is again, it's not another made-up name. It's part of the Greek tradition. Serapis was the head of a subdivision of this trans-Himalayan lodge called the Brotherhood of Luxor. It was, of course, therefore, had its sort of physical headquarters in Luxor. And Serapis was the head of that lineage. He had actually been born Greek, but he lived at this time, most of the time, in Egypt, and was the head of this order. And there was also a subdivision that he was part of called the Ellora section, which is interesting because Ellora is a place in India. So there's some kind of mysterious connection between some part of India. There's caves, and the Ellora caves, famous caves, that are connected to Buddhism again. So there's one of the famous letters from the masters was actually signed by 3 masters in one instance, Serapis. And that says Serapis Bey, which is classic. Serapis was an ancient god in the Egyptian tradition. Bey is a standard kind of name. You see this again, like Hamid Bey. There's many. It's common to use the term Bey as the second part of a name. So Serapis Bey is not, it's again a spiritual name. It wasn't the name he was born with. And in parentheses, after when he signed this letter, 3 masters did. One signed it, Serapis signed it, and in parentheses it said Ellora section. And this is from the Brotherhood of Luxor as a whole. And then the second signatory was Polydorus Iserinus. And then in parentheses it said section of Solomon, which would be more Jewish in connection. And then a third person that signed it was Robert Moore. And then it said Zoroastrian section of Zoroaster. So you get little glimpses of how, in its essence, these people were connected to a lineage that traced itself, was embedded in the planetary lineage. But at another level, it's deeply connected to Buddhism and looked to Buddha as its primary deep master on the inner planes, the primary source of inspiration. And then this Mahachohan, who was a Tibetan Buddhist. And then outwardly, so many different traditions, Christianity, the Hebrew tradition, the Neoplatonic traditions, Sufism, and certainly Sikh and Hindu and Jain and all these others as well. But as you can see, it's a specific area of the world. It's not spread throughout the entire world. We don't see a lot of, there's knowledge of, honoring, and embrace of traditions all around the world. So for instance, Blavatsky was asked to travel to places like Canada and study with Native Americans. But the concentration of that lineage is particularly in, it's kind of Indo-European, Middle Eastern. So all of those traditions going back to the ancient Egyptians, and then everything that came out of that, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Christianity, Islam, and so on. So that's one whole kind of subdivision. And then there's the Asian subdivision, which seems to be the deeper source, the most ancient source, and with the Sanatana Dharma, and then Buddhism, and the Jains, and so on. By the way, to complete that question, Kuthumi, that name actually seems to have been adopted from an ancient Vedic sage with that name. We don't really know why Kuthumi was called that. Perhaps it was a reincarnation of that sage. It's not clear, but again, it's not a made-up term. There wasn't, just like Sanat Kumara. One of the things that's a modern form of investigation that a number of people are involved in, like David Regal, is looking at theosophy, looking at books like The Secret Doctrine and The Voice of the Silence, looking at other forms of teachings that have come through other sort of sources that are connected to that tradition. And then going to original sources in these traditions like Tibetan Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhs and so on, and not to mention other sources too, but especially those, because so much of the terminology reflects those Asian sources. And seeing, what those connections are. Like, for instance, when Blavatsky talked about studying books at Sashi Longpo Monastery, and that she was guided to study by her teachers, and that the Secret Doctrine was in part based in these teachings, people like David Regal are interested in looking at, well, what were those books, and what did she call them? And can we, that was her sort of pre-scholarly translation of these Tibetan terms into English. What might they be? What are modern Tibetan Buddhists and Western scholars and so on, what are they calling these books? Can we find what the parallels are? That's a very interesting thing, but one of the things we found is in most cases there are, except for the deep esoteric sort of planetary lineage teachings that are unique to that tradition, when they talked about Buddhism, or when you look at things like their names, invariably you can find that there are actually sources that support the reality that these names were true, or these teachings had a foundation. For instance, D.T. Suzuki wrote an introduction many years ago in the early 20th century to Blavatsky's book, The Voice of the Silence, and he said, "This is remarkable. This book was written in the late 1800s and is a very authentic transmission of an authentic understanding of Mahayana Buddhism." In fact, The Voice of the Silence, which is a beautiful little book, if you haven't read it, it's fairly short and just has 3 chapters, but it's essentially a kind of blend of Hinduism, and Mahayana Buddhism. The first chapter is on the use of Nada Yoga and Kundalini Yoga to achieve nirvana. And it has a more Hindu flavor and emphasizes chakras and Kundalini and listening to the sound current as the core technique. But then the second two chapters are on the path of bodhisattvahood, and they're based deeply in Mahayana Buddhism. And then throughout it, there's little bits of intimations of the transcendent planetary lineage teachings that go beyond even the outer teachings, things that you can't find in Buddhism or Hinduism or so on. Linda asked, is there anything that is not a part of the planetary lineage? In the deepest sense, when we refer to it as the Shambhala lineage or the planetary lineage, the way I use that word in the deeper sense, then no, there isn't really anything on our planet. Certainly the beings, the understanding, the teaching, the presence of that lineage is specific to our planet. And so although it extends out to embrace a larger reality and is informed by, it's inspired by and supported by that larger reality, it is sort of the focal point of our planetary tradition. Now, there are people that do come here from other worlds, like there are people that have incarnated on the earth and do incarnate now, for whom this is the first time that they've been here, for instance. I talked to a woman 25 years ago who called me. She had been referred to me because she wanted to talk about her son, who as soon as he could begin to talk, he was telling her about how he had come here from another planet. And to her, it seemed very credible because he was very matter-of-fact about it. And he had a lot of details about life on that planet. She even asked him at one point why he came here. And he said it was because this is the only planet that he hasn't had an incarnation on yet in the solar system. This is like a 4-year-old talking. He was also very telepathic and was constantly aware of her thoughts and was aware of the thoughts of people around. Another thing that she observed that was interesting is that he seemed to have a very good sense of who he could talk to about this and who he couldn't. For instance, he wouldn't talk to his father about it. His father didn't believe in things spiritual. His mother wasn't deeply involved in spirituality, but she was open to it. And he said, I know I can't talk to Dad about this, but I sense that I can with you. And he would share a lot with her about it. And another thing that she noticed is that there would be times when he was with his friends, and most of the time he also wouldn't talk about it with them, but every once in a while he would. And because he would recognize that that person had some kind of a similar background that allowed them to have mutual understanding. And they would launch into these conversations, these 5, 6-year-old, talking about, other worlds, other planes, planets, and things like that. And then at about age 6, he announced to her one day that it was now time to him to begin forgetting about all of that, because it would be better for his assimilation into the earth to just not remember for a while. So he said, I'm going to be forgetting and I'll stop talking about this soon, but then later in my life, it'll be time and I'll remember again. And then, as he predicted, he stopped talking about it. So I think by the time she called me, he was 8 or 9 years old, and it wasn't really something, but she was quite curious, and she had talked to a mutual friend, and he referred her because of my involvement to these sort of broader kinds of spiritual themes. So when someone like that comes to the earth, in a certain sense, you could say, well, they're not truly expressing a connection to our planetary lineage primarily. In a sense, they're bringing in a different influence. Maybe their home base is in the inner dimensions of some other planet in our solar system. And so in a sense, let's say if they're an advanced person, they might be bringing a strong, quality of that. But that is actually part of our planetary lineage. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's sort of normal, especially in inner dimensions, for more advanced members of the planetary lineage to have open contact with the other, especially the other planets in our solar system, or at least, Daskalos, for instance, talked about this. Even in Yogananda's autobiography, in the wonderful chapter where Sri Yukteswar resurrects himself and appears to Yogananda and tells him a lot about what he's been involved in. He talks about the flow of life in higher dimensions between other planets and the work that goes on there, and the way that the spiritual evolution of lives is interconnected in that way. So it's not as though there's sort of like a tight boundary around our planetary lineage, and so someone coming from some place else would just be bringing in some completely different influence. There's already a strong interconnectedness and interplay between the planetary lineages, not only within our solar system, but beyond as well. And as I've mentioned, this is something that really came up more, I think, in the Western esoteric community, not so much through Blavatsky. It's a truth that people like Leadbeater and especially Alice Bailey emphasize, that on a deeper cosmic level, our planet's lineage actually has a very profound connection to the star system Sirius. You could say, in a sense, that the core planetary lineage, that part of our planet, especially that part of our planetary lineage that embodies a deep integration of the lineages, has a strong connection to the Sirian lineage, let's call it that. So, let's take our break now, and then we'll come back and. Okay, Tamara, good to see you. Yeah, we'll take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and have a meditation. Okay. Let's go within. Take a moment to settle in. Relax your body and mind. And feel yourself becoming more present. Feel your awareness expanding, becoming softer, but more alert. Just settling into the present moment and feeling your body more fully. Feeling your breath. And bring your awareness more specifically to your toes and feet as a whole. Feel as clearly as you can just your feet. And move your awareness up into your lower legs. Feeling as fully as you can your lower legs and your feet. And moving your awareness into your upper legs. And also into your pelvic region. So feeling now as clearly as you can that portion of your body from your feet to your hips. And not only direct your awareness to that part of your body, but to try to feel your awareness within your body there. Sense that your consciousness inhabits your body there. And see this region of your body surrounded and suffused, permeated with white light. Soft, warm, misty white light surrounding, permeating from your pelvis to your feet. And moving your awareness now first into your lower abdomen, to the region of your belly and solar plexus. Sense your breathing, sense the movement of your abdomen there as you breathe. And fill this part of your body with your awareness. It's as if you're extending your consciousness into your body, joining your body and your consciousness, incarnating more fully in your body. Sense how this awakens vitality in your body. And moving your awareness up into your upper torso, your chest, all the way up to your shoulders. And now visualize this region of your body too surrounded and permeated by white light. From your pelvis to your neck. Feel energy and awareness permeating this part of your body. And also down through your legs and into your feet. See the white light. Feel the energy. Sense the consciousness throughout this whole part of your body. Moving your awareness down into your arms, hands. Feel as fully as you can your arms and hands. And visualize your arms and hands surrounded and permeated by white light. Moving your awareness now up into your head. Sense the area from your shoulders up to the top of your head as clearly as you can. And see this area surrounded and permeated by white light as well. Feel your whole body surrounded and suffused with white light. Feel yourself more deeply incarnate in your whole body, filling your whole body with your awareness, your presence, and energy. Feel your soul and personality blending together. Sense every cell in your body stimulated, nurtured, while still aware of your body. And the white light that permeates and surrounds your body. Expand your awareness and sense the archangelic intelligences around you that are always there. It's part of the planetary life that supports us. Specifically working with your personality, your bodies, your physical body, your subtler bodies, nurturing, sustaining, healing. Your physical body and your personality. Simply by turning your attention to their presence, even if you don't see or experience them in any particular way, try to just sense the effect of attuning to the idea that they're there. It's part of your life, supporting your incarnation. Feel a sense of appreciation for their support. See the white light that surrounds and permeates your bodies, energized by acknowledging their presence. Sense the chakras in your body, the 7 major focal points with lots of smaller ones. And sense how these are also focal points for the work of these archangels. Feel the chakras gently nourished and stimulated by these beings. Feel their love for you. Bring your awareness more specifically back to your physical body. Continue to see the white light surrounding and permeating your body. Wish that this light not only nourish and heal your body, but also provide protection to your personality. So that anyone that would wish to harm you, consciously or unconsciously, sending negative energy your way, this white light disarms that energy, dissolves and neutralizes. It's like an immune system for your subtle energy. And feel the support of the surface that your body is resting on. Feel the concreteness of that contact. Feel your breath. And when ready, open your eyes. So we've talked about the aspect of the planetary lineage and the teachings of that lineage in the world that are somewhat, more or less, sometimes very much so, unique to that lineage. Let me say a little bit more about that now. At its core, the planetary lineage embraces a wide variety of approaches and perspectives. And advanced members of the planetary lineage, both in their physical incarnation and certainly in their work in subtler dimensions, are not sort of like rigidly determined to express a particular point of view. They work with people according to their styles, their stages of development, their history and their particular orientation. So there's a certain adaptability. At the same time, we can discern in a variety of ways a kind of core perspective that is representative of that tradition, one of those essential ideas is what in the Hindu tradition, for instance, is called the non-dual vision. That term, probably at least one of its sources, is Advaita Vedanta, because the term Advaita means essentially non-dual. This is a particular vision. It's a very common one in the East. It's not the only form of mysticism, certainly throughout the world, but even in places like India. Within the Buddhist tradition, it's essentially a fairly pretty much permeates the main schools of Buddhism, the non-dual vision. It's pretty much at the heart of Taoism as well. And then several of the schools of Hinduism, including the Shankara's Swami order, which is very influential and pervasive, is non-dual. There's strong currents of non-dualism in other traditions as well, such as to some extent in Neoplatonism, such as like the philosophy and mysticism of Plotinus. But it's not universal, but it is universal in my experience at the heart of the planetary lineage. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because my understanding and experience of non-dualism is it's the sort of most radically inclusive point of view. It's the vision that's most transcendently embracing of all of life, of all possible viewpoints, of all possible types of people, of all reality, essentially. One of the best, I think, sort of explications or descriptions or discussions of non-dualism is from the Madhyamaka teachings of Mahayana Buddhism that were particularly strongly influenced by Nagarjuna. And one of the clarities that Nagarjuna suggested is that the most transcendental reality, the most profound experience of reality, is both completely intimate and pervasive in life. It merges with everything. It recognizes the common ground of all reality. And at the same time, that depth of intimacy with all things has its foundation in a radical non-participation in a specific relative point of view. In other words, a more relative point of view would be to say something like, if we can say something, if we can conceptualize it, or if we can, like for instance, if I say, the deepest truth about reality is that all is love, or that the highest truth is truth. These words are very profound and they take us very deep into reality, truth, love, wholeness, harmony. There's many terms, life, with the capital L, has been used to just, kind of try to point at the deepest truths about reality. What non-dual vision suggests, especially in its deepest forms, in my experience, is that as profound and beautiful as all of these terms are, they can't capture the most profound mystery of reality. There's something so radically transcendental that it transcends human comprehension and human description. We can't put words on it. The first sentences of the Tao Te Ching are, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. This captures this sense that as soon as we bring it down to a particular idea about it, or a quality, or principle, or verbal description, We've already limited it. It's no longer a complete experience of that reality. Now that can sound very impersonal, but paradoxically, entering a state where you perceive reality that way is the most profoundly intimate state of consciousness. Nothing falls outside of your experience of deep communion with whatever you're experiencing, because you're not saying that one point of view is more profound than another, except in this sort of paradoxical way of saying that the absolute point of view, which is not a specific point of view, it's, there's a saying in Zen, enlightenment is the integration of 10,000 points of view. And part of what that means is, to me, is yes, profound spiritual realization includes compassion and love and harmony and beauty, joy and bliss, awe and wonder and power, vastness and emptiness and fullness and infinity and finiteness and universals and particulars and time and space and eternity. But it's not narrowly confined to any of those realities. It's an integration of 10,000 of those realities into something mysteriously more vast and inconceivable than that. And we can't, even though we can't put it into words, even though we can't conceptualize it, we can intuitively attune to it and ultimately become one with it. And in that process, as we mature in our readiness to do that, we experience tremendous freedom, tremendous sense of wholeness. So we can use words to describe what we experience as we open to that reality. But those words, those realities are not really truly a description of that radical transcendent truth that we're opening to. That's always beyond. It's eternally mysterious and transcendental. But it does fill us with love, fill us with joy, fill us with bliss, fill us with a sense of wholeness, to grow in our realization of that truth. So that's kind of the spirit of this fundamental mysticism that permeates some of these traditions. And in a sense, because of that radical context, this most vast inclusiveness, this non-dual foundation, all points of view, all paths, all stages of development, all qualities are included in that. So it's actually the foundation of a truly planetary and even ultimately more cosmic vision of an embrace of all traditions, all individual styles, all stages, all approaches, all techniques. It all has a space in this tremendous vastness that is the non-dual view. So that's one way of talking from an almost practical point of view about why inevitably advanced masters in the planetary lineage come to this deep realization of this radical view, this transcendent, so-called non-dual view. So we'll talk a lot more about that aspect of it later. But another common theme that we've talked quite a bit about is that in the manifestation of that and realizing that truth, this non-dual transcendent truth, however whether it's in, kind of looked at through the lens of Taoism or Vedanta or the different kind of subtle variations on how to understand that we see around, how to realize it. A way to actualize that in the world that's really an expression of a deep appreciation of that truth, we've been calling, among other terms, the tantric sensibility. And that's because since that non-dual truth is so profoundly embracing of all reality, including our participation in this life, it doesn't embrace negation or, in other words, trying to get away from, nor attachment to. We neither become attached to the appearance of phenomena in this world, nor do we try to get away from it and push it away. And there's some very paradoxical and mysterious way in which coming to that place of perfect balance opens us to an extraordinarily deep and intimate participation in life. And as that happens, it causes us to see into the deepest relative truths of life. We see into, for instance, it unveils the archangelic beings that support our existence. It unveils the elements in nature and the spiritual qualities and energies and truths associated with those elements, the so-called seven rays. It sort of unveils dimensions, chakras, kundalini. The more our non-dual awakening takes place, even if we're not at the stage where we're kind of deeply attuned to the deepest realizations of non-dualism, as we simply open spiritually, these kind of what we could call nature and Shakti dimensions, for instance. And this is part of the tantric sensibilities. We don't negate these energies, we don't get attached to them, but we live in harmony with them, and we become conversant with them, and we become in a partnership with these dimensions of reality. So this is all part of what I mean by this tantric sensibility. So that is pervasive. It's not always called tantra in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions. It often is. But if you look closely at traditions like Qigong, or Daskalos' teachings, or Taoism, or Kabbalah, you see strong elements of the same sensibility. So wherever I've discovered the presence of these deep expressions of the planetary lineage, invariably there's always a strong, what I'm calling tantric flavor to their approach, because it's a natural expression of a mature experience of non-dual realization. They go hand in hand. Now it's possible to separate them, so there's paths that really deeply explore the non-dual view and then don't talk specifically about some of the elements that we're talking about. But it's my feeling that if you really just settle into a deep, ancient embodiment in traditions that have lasted, say, for at least many centuries, if not thousands of years, Tibetan Buddhism and Hindu Tantra and Taoism is 2,500 years old. Invariably, there's just this richness that comes out. And the basic spirit of that experience of that richness is what I'm calling Tantra. So that's another element of that. Now, those two are not unique to the planetary lineage in the sense that, I mentioned how, for instance, if each of these traditions, you find a sort of reference to the idea that, for instance, when Blavatsky felt the need to clarify and say, well, it's not exactly accurate to say that this is esoteric Buddhism, because yes, although we have a deep connection to the Buddha and Buddhism at the deepest level, the actual teachings are not limited to Buddhism. There's something, they not only draw from a lot of sources, but there's some dimension to it that actually goes beyond any of the outer teachings. It's a sort of secret tradition, if you will. So non-dualism and Tantra are not unique to that secret tradition. Perhaps to some extent, one aspect of the planetary lineage teachings that are what we could call the septenary teachings, the notion of seven, and then fill in the blank, 7 rays, 7 elements, 7 planes, 7 chakras, and many other interrelated sevens. In fact, when Blavatsky was writing The Secret Doctrine, the majority of which was actually written by Kuthumi or Moria, who were variously who inhabited Blavatsky's body and wrote the book. At one point, one of them, my sense is Kuthumi, says one of the most characteristic or strongest indications of the planetary lineage is the sevening, he called it. Just sort of made up this phrase in English, seven with the ing at the end, sevening, like a whole style of seeing the universe in orders of seven everywhere, the sevening. And it's not as though the sevening, you can find vast evidence throughout the world in many traditions, Eastern and Western, of that sevening. What's profound about the planetary lineage is how deep their intuitive understanding of the seven is. It's their spiritual science of the sevening is extraordinarily profound and goes beyond anything that we can find. Probably the tradition that's closest to that in the outer world is actually Hinduism. Hinduism has an ancient appreciation of the septenary nature of reality. And even back to the oldest books in the Hindu tradition, like the Rig Veda, has references to the seven rishis and seven kumaras and seven lokas or planes and so on and so forth. And there's quite a richness to that tradition. Anybody that's very seriously interested in studying the seven rays would find it very enriching to go back to the Hindu teachings on the seven rays, which can be found in many different aspects of Hindu, certainly, for instance, in Kundalini Yoga and the teachings on the chakras. That's a very important doorway into understanding the seven. Well, we won't even say seven rays or seven principles. In fact, in the secret doctrine, there's a lot of very important kind of keys, secrets, or hints given in the secret doctrine that many times aren't fully explained, but they're very profound and show how deep this teaching is. But one of the things that comes out in the secret doctrine is that there's seven points of view about the seven, like the numerological point of view, the qualitative point of view, the astrological point of view, the elemental point of view, and others. So, for instance, in some of the later teachings like Leadbeater's, and then subsequently Alice Bailey's, who's very influenced by Leadbeater, she particularly emphasizes certain angles like the qualitative point of view. There's very little in Bailey's discussion about the element point of view, the seven elements. But if we add that, it adds up this whole new richness because it's all interconnected. If we add the numerological point of view, the chakra point of view. So some of these are in, for instance, Bailey, some of it's in Leadbeater, some of it's in Secret Doctrine actually doesn't explain the science in great depth, but the hints are very profound. They're strong. Like if you know how to read that, you can see the enormous depth of the sort of pointings and indicators that are in the Secret Doctrine that show probably more than any other source in modern times the vastness of the teaching on the sevening, as one of the masters put it. So that is much more indicative of and how broadly and deeply that science is understood in that tradition. And then it's used in training individuals, it's used in the organization of the work of the planetary lineage. It's used in the way that they interact with the planet. It's used in their understanding of planetary psychology and evolution, stages of evolution. It's used in their initiatory system. So it's enormously powerful. In a sense, it's part of the tantric sensibility. There's an initial stage in many spiritual traditions where there's forms of practice. We see this, for instance, in Dzogchen, where in deep Dzogchen, there are some techniques like Shinei and Trechko. These are terms that refer to a stage of Dzogchen practice, which is a profound Tibetan non-dual tradition, where you try to cut through. This is also parallel in Zen, like if you're doing koan practice in Zen, where you meditate on a particular profound, intuitive truth. Often it has a kind of puzzle nature to it. Traditional koan practice, you start with what's called a breakthrough koan. And this word trechko in Dzogchen means cutting through. It's the same idea that you want to break through into a direct glimpse of non-dual realization. And then after you've done that, and in the Zen tradition, it's generally recognized that it takes between 1 and 5 years of sustained practice on one koan. But every time you meditate, you're going deeper into this koan. Not only daily in your meditations, but maybe a couple times a year doing like a 7-day intensive retreat. So this is a very accelerated way to get through the first initiation, is that you take up this breakthrough koan, which is often something like Who Am I? Or the famous koan Mu. And then after having broken through this, usually a few years, as I said, 1 to 5 years, have this breakthrough. And then after that, it's more of an integrative type of koan. You'll go through dozens of integration koans that bring that realization back into day-to-day life, into different dimensions of human experience. And as you do that, truths just naturally arise. And that's where the sevening comes from. This is thousands, tens of thousands of year old, ultimately much deeper than that, going off into the cosmos. Even the sevening teachings, so to speak, were brought from other worlds like Venus and Mars and Sirius to the Earth. So this isn't even just some discovery on our planet, the septenary nature of reality. It's ancient, but it's confirmed again and again in generation after generation of mystics open up to these same truths. So that's a very universal aspect of that reality too, of that planetary lineage. So, for instance, in the Shambhala initiatory order, that one can directly participate in through connecting to the planetary lineage, it's based very profoundly on that septenary order of reality. In fact, for instance, there are mysteries that are revealed at each subsequent initiation. There's various facets to the initiations, and one of the aspects of that many-faceted reality of initiation is the revelation of the mysteries of nature, and each of the initiations is connected to one of the 7. And it begins at the 3rd. You get the first full revelation of a mystery at the 3rd initiation. That pertains to the 7th ray, or the 7th element, the earth element. The second for the 4th initiation, it goes to the sacral center and the 6th ray and the water element. And there's a dimension of intuitive experience that unfolds at that point. And there's certain deep mysteries and truths that are revealed. Some of these, for instance, go back to things like Marduk, because the 6th ray, the sacral center, is connected to sexuality, and the way humans experience sexuality is traceable to the Marduk disaster, the planetary disaster. So at the 4th initiation, penetrating that particular mystery also opens up a flood of intuitive insight into planetary history and our current cycle and why we're evolving in this way, and the Marduk disaster. So these mysteries are very important to planetary bodhisattvas. At this point in history, the majority of planetary bodhisattvas that are at some level connected to the planetary lineage, often in specific incarnations, don't even know about their connection to the planetary lineage. So in any given life, they might not be consciously initiated into all these things. So don't distress over the idea that maybe you don't feel immersed in these things. We're really at a stage in the unfoldment of this lineage on our planet where it hasn't deeply integrated into the world. So a lot of these insights happen more at the soul level, and then they kind of percolate down as they will. And it's rare to be physically trained in the lineage in such a way that your physical personality can deeply participate in these truths. So when I say, for instance, that the sixth principle mystery is revealed at the 4th initiation, it's likely that elements of that will come through to the fourth degree initiate's physical body, but not what it could be. When we manage to incarnate the planetary lineage more broadly in the world and really actualize a living physical plane expression of that tradition, then people will physically be able to more deeply experience and understand these more profound elements of this tradition. But we're at the very beginning. At this point in time, it's important to understand that beginning with Blavatsky and what's happened in the last century and a half or so is really just still the very bare beginnings. In fact, it's so preliminary at this point that there's not only has a lot not been revealed, and there's no strong, powerful living tradition in the world that comprehensively can initiate people into this planetary lineage. That's a big undertaking. But also necessarily just because of the stage that we're at, there's been a certain amount of misunderstanding. There's one of the things we have to get over is our lineage preferences. All of us have had a history in this and other lives of being involved or having an attraction to different teachings. For instance, I have an ancient connection to the Greek tradition, for instance, amongst various things. So some part of me obviously has a kind of resonance there. So if I encounter something like the African teachings or Australian Aborigine teachings, I might appreciate those, but I might not have as deep an affinity for those traditions. So I have to be careful. We each need to be careful not to allow that to turn into a bias where we're not open to the full beauty and truths that are reflected in all the different traditions. So one of the things we saw originally when Blavatsky began to reveal the presence of this planetary lineage, especially through the lens of the very profound trans-Himalayan tradition, which is one of the major expressions of the planetary lineage in the world. She was doing that in the context of, Europe, especially in North America and other parts of the world, where one of the main religions in the world was Christianity, or other forms of esotericism, like Kabbalah or Rosicrucianism or Sufism. So within the first 50 years, within one or two more generations after Blavatsky, people reacted to it with a variety of different perspectives and biases, not the least of which was people had their preferences, how they would like to spin it. That even caused some individuals who were originally part of the movement to split off from the movement because they didn't like Blavatsky's version of it. They decided, no, that's not really what the planetary lineage is about. We think it's this way. We think it's so much different than what Blavatsky said that they just split off and created something different. Or some people stayed part of it, but just give it, kind of give it a different flavor. In fact, the Mahat Chokan himself encouraged that to some extent because he knew we were kind of early on in the process, and better people developed some way of connecting to the planetary lineage that they could relate to than it feeling too alien. So early on, even before Blavatsky died, when they were, say, developing the London Lodge, there was some discussion about who would be an ideal person to kind of head up the London division of the Theosophical Society. And there was a woman who had strong Christian leanings who was very opinionated about that and actually sort of mildly anti-Eastern in her approach. Blavatsky thought, well, that's problematic. That's not really inclusive enough, and it certainly doesn't honor some of the ancient Indian foundations of our entire root race and our whole spiritual lineage. So that wouldn't work. But in fact, the Mahat Chokan intervened and kind of overrid her and say, yeah, we should just go ahead and have her be the person, because it does need to kind of integrate with the native traditions that are local to this part of the world, which includes Christianity. And so, yeah, so it's a compromise, and there'll be some losses because she's kind of biased a little too strongly in another direction, but that's just, part of the process. And in fact, interestingly, when Kuhumi and Mori, who were the people who originally came up with the idea for the Theosophical Society, approached the Ma Chokan about it, they had, hatched the vision that they thought it was time to make an attempt to reveal some of the planetary lineage in the world. And Ma Chokan said, well, you can go ahead and do that if you want, but my feedback is I don't think it's time yet. I think the world's not ready for this yet. And so I'll support it. I'll put my energy behind it, but I think it's a pretty iffy experiment, and we'll see if it works out. But I kind of doubt it. It doesn't feel like it's time. So that's an interesting light to put that as the incarnate head, the inner plane head of the planetary lineage, and its broadest implications are beings like the Buddha. And in a way we won't go into right now, there's other Kumaras as well, like Sanat Kumar. But the incarnate head of that lineage, the Ma Chohan, wasn't actually that optimistic about Theosophical Society working. And many people would probably look back in retrospect and say, well, yeah, it fractured into different groups. There's not only different lodges in theosophy that completely don't agree with each other. There's neo-theosophy, there's the whole Krishnamurti situation, there's spin-off groups like Steiner and the Rariks and now Spaley, and then there's all kinds of things that came later, the I Am movement and Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and things that kind of made a travesty out of the teaching. So it became this kind of messy thing where there's disagreements, and people like Helena Rarik decided the Alice Bailey teachings were bad. I don't know if people were very aware of this, but she wrote in her private letters that she actually thought that Bailey was under the influence of the Black Lodge, and that her teachings were deeply distorted by evil influences. She wrote that, you can read about this in her private, her personal letters to her disciples. I don't feel that way at all. None of these teachings are perfect. It's part of the karma of how these things are revealed in the world, that it's allowed and expected that there'll be a certain amount of bias and misinterpretation that'll happen. I think I've shared the story about how in the early days, I think it was probably around 1880s. I think Blavatsky was probably still alive at this time. Leadbeater had come on the scene, and there was movement was growing a lot, and they had developed their major international center and transferred that from New York to Adyar, India. They had a building that have a building that has a flat roof there on the original structures, and Leadbeater used to meet often with small groups of people on the roof and do teachings, and every once in a while the Tibetan would materialize. It would just come out of thin air and appear to them physically and ask them if they had any questions. And on one occasion, one of the people there, Mr. Cooper Oakley, asked the Tibetan, he said, from Blavatsky, we keep hearing about the 7 rays. There's 7 fires, 7 principles, 7 elements, 7 rays. We really don't know much about all of this yet. So could you tell us about what this is? What is the 7 rays? And the Tibetan's response is very interesting. The first thing he said was, well, the thing is, until you reach a higher level of initiation, you won't really understand it properly. So I can give you this, what I can at your stage, I can tell you something about this teaching, but because of your level of development, you'll very likely misunderstand it, and you'll get distortions about it. So do you want a little bit and get some misunderstanding, or do you want to just wait till later till you can understand it better? Of course, they said, we want it now. Tell us what you can. So the second interesting thing about that interaction, that took place is the Tibetan did give this fascinating teaching on the rays, which I think is one of the best koans, to use that Zen term, that we have available to look at a very profound perspective on the seven rays, because Leadbeater later kind of put it into a chart. And by the way, as predicted, in the very same book, you can find this, by the way, you can find this chart in early editions, certain editions, I should say, of Leadbeater's book, Masters in the Path. Unfortunately, that book has gone through several editions, and there was editing done, like sometimes things were included and sometimes they weren't. So that section of that chapter is not always in all versions of the book. So if you're looking for that book or you have it, look, depending on which copy you're looking at, that may or may not be in the book. But Leadbeater later put those teachings into a chart, and in one side of the chart is like a word or phrase to capture the spirit of that ray. And then the type of spiritual practice most strongly affiliated with that ray is another section of the chart. And then the last major religion to inevitably imperfectly express that ray, and some other things like that. There's like maybe 4 columns in the chart. And interestingly, by the way, in order to show, I think, the fullness, the vastness of the teachings on the 7 rays, the Tibetan, when he gave out the key characteristics of the rays, he decided to, I think, plant some interesting seeds for reflection by mixing up the images and the qualities. So, for instance, when he spoke of the first ray, he called it Shekinah, which is a Kabbalistic term. So that's very mysterious right there. What is that all about? Why did he choose that term? And then when he talked about the second ray, he just said wisdom. But then when he got to the third ray, instead of using a quality like wisdom, he said it's akasha, which is an element. And then the fourth ray, instead of having a quality or an element, he said birth of Horus, an Egyptian image. And then for the fifth ray, he went back to elements again. He said fire element. So you can see he's combining different ways of looking at the rays in a way that far transcends anything I've ever seen in modern literature about the richness of what these rays actually mean. But it's strongly hinted at both in that chart and certainly throughout the Secret Doctrine, and some of the other early books by Blavatsky regularly talk about how vast the science is and how it has many different interrelated dimensions to it. One of the most important to understand, by the way, is the way in which the elements are related to the rays. But subsequently, when people have tried to figure out how the rays are related to the initiations, to the chakras, to archangelic orders, unfortunately, there's some inaccuracies in all of those presentations, in my opinion. So we're still in the early stages of figuring all that out. It's important to be open-minded and to be intuitive, to be experimental, to be investigative, and over time, all of that will come to greater clarity. But we have to really respect that it's a profound science, and the early attempts to reveal these teachings from the planetary lineage were very preliminary, and were inevitably prone to being misunderstood or seen from partial points of view and so on. Let's see how we're doing for time. Oh my. Okay, well, let me take 5 minutes to see if there's any questions at this point. Let me pick up the microphones. Okay. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Patrick.
And do you have this chart available for view in some way?
You know, I think I have in my computer somewhere. I think I, created a Word version of it. So let me look around. I'll if I find that, it's easy to recreate too. So sometime in the next few days, I'll send that out to people if you're interested.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I see a question popping up here. You're welcome.
I have, if I could get myself on camera here, it's going to show the chart. It's on page 229 in Cosimo Classics version of the book, at least. Is there anyone? I don't seem to get on screen, but so.
Well, I can.
So
I think we can see it, dude. Yeah, but
yeah.
yes, if you want to hold it up for a second, people can probably also look at the recording and pause it. So yeah, back it up a little bit. There we go. A little bit higher.
Here? Higher?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I don't see myself on screen, but
I see. Tiny bit lower.
Lower.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can see there's the characteristics of the ray, and then the characteristic magic, which there's different ways to look at that, and the characteristic religion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Perhaps if there's interest, we could do a longer treatment on the seven septenary system, which we can link up to things like astrology and the planets, constellations, to chakras and elements and initiations and so on. And some of which will parallel, at least in some ways, things that have already been written, but we need to tweak things a little bit and add a lot more in order to get a kind of fuller appreciation of the system. It's really a never-ending study. It's not as though one ever finishes understanding at each stage on the spiritual path, its deeper levels of unfoldment of intuition. There's just an ongoing expansion of appreciating that. So even advanced masters on the planet are still deepening their comprehension of the depth and the vast interconnectedness that's revealed through. A key phrase I'll just throw out there as we kind of wind down for today is, in the same way there are certain principles like duality or polarity that are keys to understanding the essence of reality, like Shiva and Shakti, or non-dualism. So too, the number 7 is the key to understanding nature. And not just nature like in the physical world, but all of the manifest dimensions, the different planes and worlds, the different Shaktis, the different chakras and elements, and the fundamental organization of nature is profoundly revealed through the lens of the 7. I see okay, so yes, never-ending story. Okay, well that feels like a good place to, unless there's any little finishing up questions.
Little comment. Yes. I remember some years ago, I found an article about the Hubble telescope. They had been looking at a very particular part of the universe, apparently in the direction of where the expansion happens, like from where they think Big Bang happened. And they were able to look back 13.3 billion years. So approximately like maybe 300 million years after Big Bang. And they were able to recognize 7 major galaxies that were kind of like, they mentioned them as the 7 primordial galaxies that were like the first galaxies formed in the universe. So quite interesting in this regard.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
So it does give some context to the depth of the sevening, and it gives some depth to, well, this is my own reasoning, but the comprehension of of God, of the non-dual perception, and what I also maybe want to, I don't know if you can talk more about that, but now we are coming to the end, but I'm thinking that the non-duality is our personal connection to the highest divine, so that, you know, because humans have the capability to experience non-duality, we also connect to our inherent divinity, which is we are creators ourselves, ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm not sure if there's anything to add to that. Was there, you said there might be a question in that, but sounds complete.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Of course, to hear your comments on it is fine, but as I said, we are.
Yeah, that's a wonderful topic, and there's a powerful way in which it's almost like 2 poles, non-duality and the sevening, kind of interact and reveal each other. I think one of the things that's often not recognized in mystical or spiritual teachings and understandings is that the depth of our embrace of nature is not separable from the depth of our realizing of the essence of the non-dual. So it's not just some kind of fascinating tangent that you can get into and it's optional, that it's actually inevitable that as we go deep into our essence, all the richness of all the interconnections and patterns of nature are revealed. Or as we explore nature and lift those veils, we discover this essence that's behind it all, the non-dual truth that whichever way we go, each reveals the other. And so as non-dual realization, for instance, deepens, it's inevitable that we come to appreciate and participate in that vast cosmology of the sevening and nature. And so I don't know if that's the kind of comment you were maybe evoking, but it's helpful.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you next week.